Now, our speaker today, Mr. Dan Barker, represents a more active force and capable force in our society, calling for reason and free thought, for evolution past religion, fighting for reason, and defending secular society from the pressures of fundamentalism. Now, Mr. Dan Barker is not alone in this fight, but he's especially compelling because of the perspective and experience that he brings. Dan was not only a born-again Christian, he also used to preach the good news of the gospel for 19 years. And Richard Dawkins described him as not just a preacher, but a preacher you would not want to have sit next to you on a bus. Somebody who was outspoken and evangelical. Alas, Mr. Barker opened his mind and made the mistake of reading past simple Christian authors that raised a series of questions and slowly opened his mind to the possibility that his religious feelings and sentiments and questions and communications were perhaps coming from within rather than without. And after 5 years, he came out in 1984 as an atheist. And since then, he has been a growing and significant voice. He lives in Wisconsin, but he's a national figure as co-president of the Freedom from Religion Foundation with his wife, Annie Laurie Gaylor. He has, in that sort of national figure role, he's faced off with Hannity and Combs, spoken on Good Morning America, spoken with Phil Donahue, Tom Leykis, and many others. He's had the honor and privilege of being kicked off Fox News. He's had the courage and perhaps folly of tangling with Daily Show correspondents. He continues to be a national voice representing reason, representing atheism, and describing and joining those debates with national figures. He gives speeches for the Secular Student Alliance, and he also runs a weekly radio, or as a co-host of a weekly radio show, the Free Thought Radio, run out of Madison, Wisconsin. I hope you will join me today in welcoming and thanking Mr. Dan Barker and for his speech today.
Thank you, Ben. And I think our attorneys have dealt with you on some things in the past. He's an attorney, and we have 5 attorneys in our office, and some of them deal with the military. One recent case was Bibles in a Navy hotel, which they took out, but then they decided, oops, we shouldn't follow policy. Let's put them back in again. So we deal with those things all the time. The Freedom from Religion Foundation in Madison, Wisconsin. We just finished a huge expansion. We're finally coming up for air after a 2-year building expansion. I remember being here back about 15 years ago when there was, this part wasn't here, right? This is only about 10 years old, this part. What a great community you guys have here. What a wonderful EHS place to come together and think whatever you want to think. Isn't it nice to be in a room where you can say what you want and no one cares? You can just be yourself. So. And then there's also some new people here, members of the Freedom from Religion Foundation. Did some of you come because of a card? Good to see you here. We have a chapter in the area. What's the name of it? Tom, you're in the back. Tom Cara, the Greater Chicago?
Freedom from Religion Foundation, Metropolitan Chicago chapter.
FFRF, MCQ, whatever. And very big. Are you guys going to put up another display in Daily Plaza this year? Yeah, great. See, you might have seen it. It was one of the big Richard Dawkins A that was put up there, and Tom and members of the chapter here spearheaded that event. And so we like to get together and talk. We think talking is important, but you've heard the old saying, after all is said and done, usually more is said than done. We like to do things. We want to make a difference. We want to challenge in the courts. We want to challenge in not only the legal courts, but in the courts of public opinion. So it's nice to see that free thought is growing. And we use the word free thought. By the way, if you look it up in the dictionary, it's a single word. Free thought, free thinker. We use it as a kind of umbrella term for atheists, agnostics, secular humanists, atheists, whatever you want to call yourself. And in our group, we don't have any litmus tests. We don't care what we call ourselves. We all disbelieve in the same God. So that's Charles Strauss is the famous Broadway composer. He wrote Bye Bye Birdie. He wrote Annie, The Sun Will Come Up Tomorrow, and all these great songs. we had him speak at our conference a few years ago, and he turned to me and he said, "You know what, Dan? I'm a lifelong atheist." And he's a civil rights activist, and he marched with Sammy Davis Jr. down in Selma. He really cares. He's in his mid-80s now. And he said, "But I've never written a song about religion or my views or any of that. Send me some lyrics, and I'll set them to music." So would you like to hear the song? The multitudes mumble mythologies without end. But me, I have trouble with ologies that pretend to show what can't be shown, to know what can't be known. Lutherans have liturgies, Calvinists have creeds, Muslims have their minarets, Catholics have their beads, Methodists have methods, holy truth to ascertain, but poor little me, I only have a brain. Bishops transubstantiate, Shintos ring their bells, Transcendentalists meditate while Wiccans weave their spells. Hindus chant a mantra when they can't relieve the pain. But poor little me, I only have a brain. So fearful of the Netherland, believers band together. Unhappy with the weatherman, the Zunies wave a feather. They dance in circles to demand great spirit send some rain. But what do you do if you only have a brain? Quakers quake and Shakers shake, and Jews eat kosher food. Rastafarians wear their hair in pious gratitude. They all talk of miracles that no one can explain, but poor little me, I only have a brain. So fearful of the Netherland, believers band together. Unhappy with the weatherman, the Zunies wave a feather. They dance in circles to demand great spirits send some rain. But what do you do if you only have a brain? Quakers quake and Shakers shake, and Jews eat kosher food. Rastafarians wear their hair in pious gratitude. They all boast of miracles that no one can explain. But poor little me, I only have a brain. That was Charles Strauss, and I never would have imagined chord progressions like that. He broke a bunch of rules, but it works. Isn't that neat how composers can just do these things that you're not supposed to do, and then it makes music? Well, I think all art is like that. All art should have something unusual, unexpected, some rule breaking, and maybe all good thinking should have some rule breaking in it too, right? Don't just do what everyone else thinks you should do. If we have time, maybe I'll do a couple more tunes, because music is... I used to be a gospel pianist, and I used to play gospel TV and records and that. And I used to preach the good news, like Ben said earlier, the good news of the gospel. And now I have some better news. And in a minute, I'm going to tell you what the truly good news of atheism is. Or if you don't like the word atheism, then non-belief, whatever you feel comfortable saying, or secularism. I like the word atheist. I think atheist is a positive word. It is a negatively constructed word, not theism, but it's a double negative. There's a lot of words that are double negatives, like independence, right? That's a negative word, but it's a positive concept. So when I was a minister of the gospel, I used to travel around preaching, evangelizing, missionizing. I spent about 2 years in Mexico trying to convert Catholics into Christians. And it worked, actually. A whole bunch of them have become Pentecostal Protestants and that. In fact, one of my friends who was one of those Mexican converts became a Christian missionary. He has now come out of the ministry. He's now an atheist. He's writing a new book about it. And I got to write the foreword for Fernando Alcantar's new book, which is a pretty exciting story. The missionary who's now a reverse missionary, kind of like me. But the good news that I used to preach, which really isn't good news at all, is it's really this. Suppose you're walking by my house one day, and I come out on the front porch, and I say, "Hey, stop for a minute. I got some good news for you." And you stop and you look, who is this guy? Listen to me. I'm important. I'm somebody special, and you've been walking by, you've been ignoring me. You've just been walking by, living your life and not paying me any attention. I'm a great person. I need to be respected and admired, and I love you. And you're looking up, And ignoring me all that time made me really, really angry. And I've got some great news for you. You want to know what the really good news? You don't have to go down in my basement. Isn't that great news? I was so angry that you've been ignoring me all this time that I built a torture chamber down in my basement. There's fire down there. There's a big furnace. There's some stinky vats full of chemicals, and there's these sharp knives, and there's hooks on the wall, and it's ghastly. But the good news is you don't have to go down there. I sent my son down there. It was a horrible passion. It was terrible. There was these lake of fire chemicals, but he went down there and suffered in agony and shame, and that satisfied my anger, and I'm not mad at you anymore. So really, it's all over. It is finished. All you have to do is come on up here to my porch. Come on up here and just give my son a big hug and tell him thank you, and you love him for what he did for you, and I'll give you a hug too, and we'll move in together. Come on, move in with me. We'll live up in the upper floor, up in the attic or whatever, and you can tell me forever and ever how great I am. Isn't that the best news you've ever heard? So what would you do? Would you just keep walking, or what? Would you like, I'm sorry, I got to get to work. I got a life to live. Well, that's the good news of the gospel. For God so loved the world that he gave his only begotten Son, that whosoever believes in him should not perish but have everlasting life. And somehow I used to think that was great news. God killed his own son, filicide, in order to save someone else from his own punishment because he was so angry. Even if that were true, all right? Just imagine in some crazy world that that's actually a true story. Why would that engender any admiration? You might say, uh-oh, I better believe. I don't want to go down in the basement. Uh-oh, I'm going to believe. Oh, thank you so much. It's really a sick kind of mentality, and it's based on this low self-image that humans have. There would be no ministers, no evangelists, no preachers, no priests, if there wasn't a flock out there wondering, waiting, what, somebody tell me. Richard Dawkins was right in the introduction to my book, Godless, when he said, I was the kind of preacher you would not want to sit next to on a bus. He went on to say, and I don't know if this is a compliment or not, he went on to say, Dan Barker is the most eloquent spokesperson of internal delusion that I know. because I was internally deluded. I really thought that you poor lost skeptics, you poor evil humanists, what's wrong with you people? What's wrong with you that you don't see the beauty of the gospel? And I really thought I had this great message that when you heard me talk and you saw my eyes and you felt the Spirit of God and the Word of God was going to... Have you ever met people like that? You know, they're super confident, right? They really have it. They know they've got absolute values and absolute morals, and they know they've got this beautiful thing, and you don't. You're missing it, right? And sometimes they get tears in their eyes. I would look at you on the bus. I would sit next to you, and I'd talk to you for a while. You know, chit-chat. Kind of like sales. It's kind of like a sales thing. Because really, evangelism is just sales, right? You can't sell something to someone who doesn't need it, so you got to convince somebody, you need what I'm selling. So you can't really sell salvation. First, you have to sell damnation. You have to sell the basement, right? You've got to sell that. And then if somebody believes that, so how are you doing? By the way, I'm sorry for sounding pushy here, but it looks to me like you're having some real problems in your life, aren't you? How does he know? And you know what? You feel like there's no meaning and no purpose. You feel like there's no, why are you on this planet? What's it all about? What's your purpose in life? Well, Jesus is the answer. Well, you've heard sermons like that, right? The good news of Jesus. Well, I think there's even better news. I think it's totally upside down. That person sitting on the bus, and you'd be surprised how many gullible people there are. You wouldn't be like that, right? What would you have said to me? Where were you guys, by the way, when I was preaching? Why didn't any of you come up to me? Why are you keeping your mouth shut? That would have made a big impact on me if you had just said something. Even just, not a big argument, but if you just simply said, I respect you, but I don't believe that. At least say that. At least let them know that there's people who don't agree with them. But these people sitting there, they have this upside down picture of reality. They think meaning and purpose comes from up above and has to be fed down to us from some higher authority, right? In fact, our country, the United States of America, was the first country in history to flip that upside down. All countries before that, and many since then, were based on some sovereign authority, the monarchy or the sovereign authority of the church, or by the blessings of providence, we ordain and establish this whatever, you know what I mean? It was all based on something up there giving us our rights, giving us our freedoms, right? But what did we do in the United States? We did this. What's the first words of our Constitution? Yeah, we the people. It's upside down. We flipped it upside down. Where most religious thinking is this way, which is top-down kind of thinking, we non-believers and we people who believe in equality and freedom and true democracy think it's bottom-up. Life is bottom-up instead of top-down. Instead of waiting for some orders from your commanding officer, right? Here's what thou shalt do, and then you have to do what you're told, right? If you live in the military, or if you're a slave, right? I didn't directly equate those two, but you can see what I'm saying. There's a structure where there's some authority above, and then we down here beneath, we need to look at what should I do? What is it? So the person sitting on the bus often would say, I don't know why I'm here. What is my purpose in life? So I have a new book out, which is the title of my topic. The book is called Life-Driven Purpose. Some of you get it, right? What is that referring to? Rick Warren has a book called Purpose-Driven Life, and I thought, let's turn it upside down. Oops, let's do it this way. Not purpose-driven life, but life-driven purpose. Not top-down, but bottom-up. Rick Warren, the big mega-selling author of The Purpose-Driven Life. Have any of you read the book, by the way? One of you. That's too bad. That's too bad for you. No, really, you can read it, of course, but it's nothing new. It's just this, it's kind of newly packaged, old-fashioned biblical fundamentalism. That's all it is. He thinks the number 40 is important, so he made 40 chapters, and you're supposed to read one chapter a day, and you'll have a purpose-driven life, right? Let me sum up what his book says, basically, so you don't have to read it. You know what the purpose of life is, according to Rick Warren? And he sold tens of millions of copies of this book. You know what it is? Basically, that's right. To know God, to glorify God, to worship Him, and to associate with other believers and try to get other people to come with you to church too. That's why you were placed on this planet. The very first sentence of Rick Warren's book is, "It's not about you." So guess what the first sentence of my new book is? It is about you. It's not top down, it's bottom up. It is about you. What else is purpose? What does purpose mean? Rick Warren came to our attention in the late 1990s when the IRS made a determination that he was cheating the government. There's a little known provision, ministers know about it, of course. Priests, rabbis, ministers. There's a provision in the IRS code that allows, and it even says this phrase, ministers of the gospel. Look it up. It's section 107. Ministers of the gospel can exclude their housing from income. Wouldn't you love to do that? Next year when you're doing your taxes, wouldn't you say, oh, all my rent, all my house payments, that's not even income. It would lower your tax liability a lot, right? What a huge deduction that would be. Ministers and priests and rabbis and any other clergy, including cantors, and it's being abused a lot. Basketball coaches at Catholic high schools. Pat Robertson was ordaining his entire staff, including the janitors, calling them ministers of the gospel to get this break. Well, Rick Warren in the late 1990s got his church to declare his entire salary as a housing allowance. The whole thing. And the IRS said, you can't do that. And they made a determination, and they were going to assess penalties and make him pay back taxes. And guess what Rick Warren did? A preacher who preaches from the Bible who says, be subject to all authorities and respect the authorities that God has put on this planet. Guess what Rick Warren did? He sued the government. It's Warren versus Tax Commission. He sued the government saying, well, yeah, I did declare my entire salary as a housing allowance, and he paid zero taxes. But the IRS code didn't specify exactly what limit there was, right? Look at these big megachurch pastors who have $1 million homes, and they ordain 26 people on their staffs because they want to take care of this break, right? Take advantage of it. So he sued, and before the lawsuit was finished, Congress stepped in just for him. Congress changed the law just for Rick Warren so that from now on, Section 107 now limits the housing allowance to fair rental value. And he was grandfathered out. He didn't have to pay back taxes or penalties. So from now on, it has to be a fair rental value of it, right? By the way, the Freedom from Religion Foundation is suing over that. We don't think it's fair. We don't think in a country of we the people that there should be this higher class of clergy that get special breaks. We're all the same. Our president is called Mr. President, right? We don't live in a country with this state church hierarchy. We live in a country where it's all bottom up, we the people. We all should be equal. So we're suing over that and pursuing legal action over the housing allowance. So if we don't have a purpose-driven life, it's actually good that we don't. I think the really good news, and I'll say it right now, the really good news that we non-believers offer to the world, this is going to sound maybe wrong. It's going to sound counterintuitive. It's going to sound like, huh? But I think the really good news that we non-believers offer to the world is this. There is no purpose of life. And that's great news. If there were a purpose of life, we would be secondary. We would be the inferior member of the military. We would be the slave. We would be the... Are you anybody superior? No? Somewhere? Okay, good. Yeah. But superior intelligence is a different thing, right? From superior rank. He has to be careful what he says. Is this being recorded, right? And he knows the law. So it's great news if there's no purpose of life, because life then is its own reward. If there's a God, is he sitting up whatever, up or out or whatever, however you describe this realm that this being lives in? If there's a God, is he sitting up there scratching his head going, what's my meaning of life? What's my purpose? Who's going to tell me what is my purpose? How am I going to know that I'm doing a good job? What's it all about? Why am I here? If nothing comes from nothing, why is there a God instead of no God? Is he thinking those things too? He just gets to be, right? If there's a God, this being, I said he, but this being gets to be, right? So why can't we just get to be? Why can't we just be who we are and live our lives as natural biological organisms in this natural environment? So to say there's no purpose of life is immensely freeing, because if there is a purpose of life, that makes us slaves. And have you ever noticed the postures of prayer? Have you ever noticed when people are praying, what are they doing? You bow your head, right? Why do that? Why kneel down? Why do that? What's the point of it? And what is this? What is that? Your wrists are shackled together like a slave. You're down before the big master, the big man, the alpha male, yes, you are everything and you are great and I am nothing and I'm no threat to you. It's very humiliating. It's a very demeaning posture to put yourself in, to show that you are just this little thing and there's this great. A lot of scientists are hypothesizing that we got this from our alpha primate male ancestors who controlled the territory and the females, and you better curry favor with this big man up there, or else you're not going to get anywhere in life, or the king or the dictator or the lord or the sovereign. But there is no purpose of life, and there can't be, because what does purpose actually mean? What is purpose? Purpose isn't following orders. Purpose really is aiming for a goal. Why does the roots of a tree, why do they reach to the river? Purpose is any striving, any goal, any desire, any target of a living organism. I was at the Houston Museum of Natural History this last week, looking at some of the fossils of some of those organisms. And you can imagine they were frozen in time, but they were striving, they were reaching. They might have been trying to get away from something. Is this something that will help me? Is it where I can find shelter or find food or find a mate or avoid a predator? There's always a biological organism has purpose when it has a goal that is trying to achieve some target, some aim, which usually relates to physical survival in some way or another. It relates to our survival and the enjoyment of our survival. So it's good that there's no purpose of life, but, and here's the point on which my whole book hinges, to say that there's no purpose of life is not to say that there's no purpose in life. We all have immensely rich lives of purpose as we go about our daily lives. And it's somewhat the same and somewhat different for all of us, depending on our situations. It's the purpose in life that enriches our lives. Who would dare claim, for example, that Elizabeth Cady Stanton, who was a lifelong atheist, by the way, and her friend and co-worker, Susan B. Anthony, who was an agnostic Unitarian, who admired Elizabeth Cady Stanton's forthrightness on religion, but Susan was a little more, I don't want to quite go as far as you, Elizabeth, but anyway, they were great friends. And Elizabeth Cady Stanton said it's the church that's the main problem for women. It's the church and the Bible that are keeping women back. She dedicated 50 years of her life to fighting for this really crazy idea. This is going to sound weird. This crazy idea that women should participate in their own democracy. Can you imagine that? It's been less than 100 years in this country that women have been able to vote. We think that's crazy now, don't we? But it was the church that was holding it back. Women were told to keep silent and learn from their husbands in all subjection. That basic biblical religious mentality. Elizabeth Cady Stanton did not have a purpose of life. Her own life, bottom up, was the purpose. And then she found purpose in life. And she worked for these goals. She worked for these things. Margaret Sanger with birth control. You can think of even in art, like Charles Strauss, the Broadway composer, who's a lifelong atheist, who has found a life of purpose in his life, creating beauty. Scientists who are trying to find knowledge. Maybe you have a sibling or a relative who dies of some rare disease, and it bothers you, obviously, and so you dedicate your life to fighting that rare disease. That wasn't handed down to you from above. It wasn't like a commanding officer saying, here's what thou must do. You chose it. You decided, because of your own feelings and your altruism and your human nature, you decided to pursue whatever it is you want to pursue, whatever you think it is. So I think we non-believers have real purpose in our lives. Not purpose-driven life, but we have life-driven purpose. Daniel Dennett, who's the great philosopher, wrote the foreword to my book, and he points out that, for most of the history of our species, human beings weren't sitting around twiddling their thumbs going, what's the meaning of my life? Do dolphins and cats and butterflies, and I went into the butterfly room there at the Houston Museum. That was really amazing, and they took a picture of me with a butterfly right on my forehead. That was so. Obviously we have more consciousness, however you define that word, and Dennett calls consciousness basically the kind of center of narrative gravity, which really isn't a thing at all. But we obviously have more consciousness than a butterfly, but it must have some. It must be on a continuum. All living organisms must have some perception, My daughter thinks all creatures have awareness and consciousness. I don't know if I would go that far, but at least they don't have zero, do they? They're organisms. They're just striving. They're perceiving. They're working. And maybe we don't have 100. Maybe we're only, who knows where that continuum is. But we strive. We work. We try to improve. We try to make the world a better place. So a life of purpose is a life in which we have purpose in our lives. The final chapter on my book talks about meaning, and there's a difference between meaning and purpose. But I talk about a lot of personal stories. The middle chapters of the book, one is called Mere Morality, and I think you'll get that title, some of you. From what? Yeah, from C.S. Lewis's book, Mere Christianity. C.S. Lewis tried. I think he was a wonderful writer. I didn't think he had that much to say. I wish I could write like C.S. Lewis wrote. I don't know if he was that great of a thinker, but he was a great writer, and he put things together. He's like a lot of preachers who get up on Sunday morning. They have nothing to say, but they say it beautifully. Have you ever noticed? And you go out, wow, wasn't that amazing, right? I'd rather hear somebody who doesn't speak that well, but has something to say, right? You've got something to learn, information. But C.S. Lewis thought you could boil down Christianity, strip off all the non-essential layers, because there's all these different groups and they have these different doctrines and these different things. And he said, but what is the actual core at the center of the onion? What is the mere Christianity? What is that actual true Christian thought? And it was a valiant effort, but he obviously didn't succeed because nobody agrees with him still even today. What is I happen to think there are as many Christianities as there are Christians. Each one kind of picks their own, and you see all these different churches, and they sort of self-select who comes to these churches. Some churches are more emotional, some are more intellectual, some are more social-minded, whatever. But C.S. Lewis tried to do that, and I tried to do the same thing with the question of morality. Morality, in principle, is really simple, but in practice, it's a big, lumbering thing. There's all these moral philosophies and disagreements, and friendly disagreements among philosophers and believers and non-believers alike. So in mere morality, I made my attempt to strip basic morality down to the mere morality, which I basically conclude by saying morality is really the intention to act with minimal harm in the world. If your intention is to have to minimize harm, you are by definition a moral person. But that's mere morality, of course, of more rich moral life, and it goes beyond that, and that's compassion and charity and giving and maybe sacrificing and whatever, however we want to enrich our moral lives. I have a chapter in the book on that question, can something come from nothing? And if you think about it, and I said this during my debate at Oxford with Michael Shermer and Peter Milliken, and we had to wear tuxedos and bow ties, and it was very, very parliamentarian, very proper debate we had, which is really fun. You can see it online. Lennox, what was his name? John Lennox, the mathematician. He said, "How can there be something instead of nothing? How can nothing come from nothing?" And I basically turned to him and I said, "Well, if nothing comes from nothing, if something had to come from something, and if God is something, then by your very argument, God can't exist, right? Because if nothing comes from nothing, how can even God be here?" But I try to unpack that in my own quirky philosophical way. Why is there something instead of nothing? And what does that question even mean? Maybe it's not even an askable question. It'd be like getting up and asking, and Daniel Dennett calls these questions deepities. You know, a deepity is like a question that sounds like, wow. His daughter gave him that word, by the way. It's a question that sounds, whoa. It's like asking, what is north of the North Pole? Oh, I thought about it. I don't know. Somebody help me out here. You're trying to answer a question that's not even askable. You know what I mean? Once you ask it and you put it into words and you have the semantics and it looks like it's making sense, wow. So can something come from nothing? Sounds like an askable question, but is it? Maybe it's just one of those deepities that we're torturing ourselves, running around in circles, because it's just a human-made abstraction that we're trying to then justify with more human-made abstractions. And then the last chapter, the remaining chapter in the book is called Religious Colorblindness, in which I make an attempt to explain what's going on in the mind, well, in my mind, when I was a believer. What was going on in my brain? Because I was a true believer. Have you ever had a conversation with a true believer and you thought you were talking to each other? But then you realize, we're not even connecting here. Why? Why is it? We're saying the same words and they're saying, and so you walk away scratching your head and they're walking away scratching their heads. Like, huh? So why is it? What's wrong in the minds of believers and non-believers? What's going on here with this disconnect? And my chapter, Religious Colorblindness, makes an attempt to explain, at least from my perspective, what was going on in my brain when I was trying to talk with you godless, evil, humanist people, you know? Trying to get you to understand the truth, right? And you're trying to get me to understand the truth. So what the heck is going on? Why is that? There's been a lot of books written about it, but I made my own little stab at that. So, shall I end with a song? Do we have time? Or certainly, absolutely. Okay. When I was a preacher, I used to try to sell damnation before I could sell salvation. And one of the very first songs I wrote as a non-believer is called "You Can't Win with Original Sin." You can't win with original sin. It doesn't even matter how intelligent or kind you may have been. You just can't win. It was all over before it began. You were doomed in the fall of man. You can't win. I was dead before my life had begun. I was dead because of something my great-great-great-grandparents had done. That's no fun. Adam and Eve didn't do any wrong. They were set up by God all along. They couldn't win. I've been told I must believe on Jesus Christ to be saved. But first, I must admit that I am totally depraved. No way. Before you go pointing that finger of blame, just remember, Eve was framed. She couldn't win. Kind of God who's so insecure that he needs to send me to hell is the kind of God who'd probably get a big kick out of damning all the Christians as well. You never could tell. It was all over before it began. I was doomed in the fall of man. But as a skeptic, I must insist Adam and Eve didn't really exist, and neither does God then, for that matter. And until the day that old myth is shattered, we cannot win. No, you just can't win.
Mr. Barker has graciously agreed to play another song.
I appreciated your talk. I thought it was very good. Could you tell us briefly how you were transformed from a fundamentalist Protestant to a humanist, atheist, whatever?
Some people say
I gave up
fundamentalist atheist.
Yeah.
So the very first time I spoke about this, it was just 9 months after I was preaching. It was on Oprah Winfrey's AM Chicago show. Do you remember that when she was in Chicago before? 1984, and Ann and Annie Laurie invited me, and they heard this guy who was a preacher, now he's an atheist. So the very first time I even spoke before any people, and I actually never had knowingly met any other atheists, was on her show, and she asked me that question. Oprah said, "So Dan, why did you leave the faith?" And I said, well, after all those years of not being able to sleep in on Sunday morning, right? But I summarized it basically by saying I thought about it. I went through a gradual 4 or 5 year process of moving. You don't just move from fundamentalist Christian to atheist overnight. It took me 4 or 5 years of gradually moving. The majority of it was within Christianity. From a hard-nosed conservative to more of a moderate for a while, and then to more of a liberal. And I finally dumped out all the bathwater, and I found out there's no baby there. It's just, so that's kind of my story. It was intellectual. It was horrible. It was just, I lost. And it's funny because I was still praying all through it all. Even when I was an atheist, I would still say, "Well, God, I know you're not there." I was talking to him because your brain has all these habits, It was weird. But I wrote a book about it. It's called Godless. And you can, if you want the meat of the story, what's wrong with the Bible, what's wrong with the resurrection story, what's wrong with the arguments for God, all of those things that we talk about in debates, it's in that book.
All right. I should have mentioned this before. Anybody who's upstairs that has a question, if you can just come down the staircase, otherwise I won't probably catch you.
Hello, thank you very much for the talk. I enjoyed it. So I guess going back to sort of when I'm over here.
Oh, there you are in the back. Okay.
Yeah. When you were a believer and you were trying to, convert people and talk to them, I think that was interesting when you said that you wish somebody would have said, I don't believe that. Do you think that while you were in that mindset that would have really had as much of an impact on you? Because, I feel I have done that personally before, and I just feel like it's not really, like you said, you're not connected on that level, so it doesn't really make an impact on them. How do you feel it would have impacted you then?
Yes, it would have had some impact. It would not have converted me. I wouldn't have gone, oh, how could I have been so stupid? I wouldn't have just like that. But it would have had some impact. And the believer that you're talking to, those believers fall across a continuum too. Some of them are more or less open to reason and science and learning and all those things, and some are not. So for some of them, it really is a hopeless case. But for others, there's me. And I wouldn't have said anything to you, but it would have made an impact. Two things would have impressed me. I was a fundamentalist. And not all believers are like me, so you can't paint them all with the same brush. Some are more moderate, some are more liberal. But the Bible is one. If you had been able to show me some problems with the Bible, contradictions or immoral teachings in the Bible, that would have been like, well, would have put me on the defensive. You know what I mean? The second one is morality. If you could have shown me that you're living a good, full, purposeful, meaningful, loving, caring life, and you're doing these things, and you don't have a God, that undercut my whole absolutistic fundamentalist thinking. So maybe you don't even have to say anything. They can just see you picking up the trash and helping this homeless person or whatever you're doing. They can see you doing that. That would have made an impact on me, at least, to get me to start thinking. I've heard some people say, and I think I disagree with this, that you can't reason someone out of a position that they did not reason themselves into. That kind of sounds right, doesn't it? But I did. I reasoned my way out, and some of you did, right? Some of you in this audience probably thought it through, right? You were believers, you went to church, and you finally just... So it can happen. And of course, you can't predict what's going to happen with that person, but I wish someone had said something. I wish someone had ridiculed me a little bit. I know we talk about we shouldn't ridicule believers, but I think there's a place for ridicule, as long as that's not all you're doing. If you're only ridiculing, well, that's dumb. But the occasional mockery or ridicule can go a long way, and then back it up with good arguments and back it up with a caring person. You're not just trying to destroy them. You want to... So you believe in a book that has a talking snake. You're free to believe that, but snakes don't have vocal cords. Anyway, and stuff like that. That would have helped me, and I wish I would have known that the world wasn't a total Christian world, and I wish I had known that you believers were not just these blind, selfish sinners out wanting to rape and kill and steal because you don't want any moral restraints on your life. I wish I would have seen that and known that.
Then I found that arguing is not only not working on the cognitive level, but people are emotionally want to belong to religion, its community, and they don't care whether it makes sense. That it's separation of state and church that it should be our priority. So my question to you, and I admire FFRF efforts a lot. What are your priorities as far as activism, as far as religion and secular life in this country?
In our organization, our priority is to work for a secular government, which is not anti-religious. Secular doesn't mean anti-religious. So we have two purposes. One is to keep state and church separate, which is constitutional. So I guess you could say our bedrock in our organization is that First Amendment to the U.S. Constitution. The Establishment Clause mainly, and the Free Exercise Clause, those two clauses. But our second purpose is to educate the public about the views of non-believers. So we will complain about 10 Commandments. These big, those big Cecil B. DeMille 10 Commandments that you've seen them all over the country, the Eagles put up. There was one in front of a high school or a middle school in Pennsylvania. We sued, and they just removed it. The court decided, a conservative judge who loves the Bible and reluctantly said, you know what, Ten Commandments are probably good, but they don't belong in a public school. So they moved it. And it just happened like, last week or 2 weeks ago, they picked it up and moved it to private property. They gave it to the Lions Club, the people that originally gave it to them, which is one thing. But then people always ask us, well, what's wrong with the Ten Commandments? Why don't you want the Ten Commandments in front of the school? So that's where we get into our second purpose, explaining that there are Americans who don't think those are good moral teachings, and here's why. We live by what we think is a better, more kind, more rational way of living. So it goes hand in hand. I guess most of our energies are put into state-church separation. We actually have 7 full-time attorneys. 2 of them are fellows, but we have 5 full-time attorneys and interns working to keep the government separate, which allows you and me the freedom to believe or not believe. But I still think proactive free thought, proactive atheism, is a good thing to do in the world. The believers don't hesitate. It's not that we're going to win the argument, and it's not that we're going to be lifelong friends from now on, but at least let the world know that we live in a mosaic of a country. It's very diverse, and we all have different points of view, and we non-believers are here too. Like it or not, this is our country too. She came down 18 steps to ask her question.
Pew Research has identified a demographic group called spiritual but not religious. I'm wondering if that's incompatible with humanism or atheism, or is there an atheist spirituality? Are they a contradiction in terms?
Some people say yes. Sam Harris says yes, you can be spiritual and be an atheist, and he's got a good book about it. Others say no, but I think it just depends how you define the word spirit. Actually, the word spirit has never been defined. The word spiritual has never been defined, at least not in positive terms. It's always what it is not, the intangible, the non-corporeal, the immaterial essence. No one ever defines what a spirit actually is. It's always the absence of something else. And so when you use the word spirit philosophically, you may as well just say blah, blah, blah. What does it actually mean? And we think we have an idea of what we mean by spiritual, something that transcends us, something that's bigger than the sum of its parts, the gestalt. You know, we think we have some kind of an idea, but actually what is it? There used to be the word ether way back when scientists concluded, and almost all scientists in the planet said, yep, there has to be an ether because if light is a wave, something's waving, right? So everybody believed in the word ether until Einstein came along and proved that, nope, there is no such thing. But we still have the word ether. We have the word ethereal, right? Ethereal and spiritual are like synonyms of each other, right? That which is kind of beyond and untouchable. Well, what is it? But if you want to define the word spiritual with a lowercase s, kind of like a synonym for a natural experience that we all have, for example, aesthetics, the feelings of altruism, the illusion we have that we are greater, the sum is greater than the parts. You know, if you want to, when you go to a concert, to an opera or a rock concert, and you're feeling this kind of like, whoa, I'm part of something bigger than me. If you want to call that spiritual, then fine. But you're not talking in transcendent words, you're just talking in natural terms. The emotions that we have. If you want to call those spiritual. The dedication to something other than yourself. You know, dedication to a bigger world, a bigger community. If you want to call that spiritual, fine. You're not pretending that it goes beyond the natural world. Then yes, we atheists have all of that. We could, you know, I don't like the word spiritual because for me it used to mean something else. But I bet there are atheists in this room who do feel like they have a spiritual life, which is fine. You're not saying it's a supernatural thing, but it's your own natural life. So yes, believers don't have a corner on any of that. Believers don't have a corner on emotion or love or feelings of aesthetics or beauty or longing or striving or all of those things that make us reach outside of ourselves to become more than just our own individual selves. Yes, there is what you might call, I wouldn't use the phrase, but you can be a spiritual atheist, I think, yeah.
I asked this question. I was speaking to a very good friend recently who was an extremely ethical person. She does believe in God. And we were talking about morality. And she was saying that she thinks that, she said, oh, Ellen, you know, you're a really good person and you don't need to have this God up above to tell you, you know, that you're fearful. You don't need to be ethical because you're fearful of God. But she was saying that she thinks a problem with our society is that, less people believe in God, and therefore, and I suppose she's basically saying, they're not going to be ethical unless they're afraid of something. They're afraid of something raining down on them. That, a lot of people aren't that way. And I was just, I was kind of just wondering what your response would be. I wasn't sure what to say to her. I think you can raise your children not to be that way, but I was just wondering what your response to that would be.
Yeah, and I talk about that in my chapter, Mere Morality. What you just described and what she's describing is a toddler mentality. I need the parent figure to tell me. Suppose that the little kid's going to run out in the street, and the daddy grabs him. Don't run out in the street. And the kid says, "Why not?" And the dad says, "Because I said so. I'm your father. You don't want to disrespect my authority. If you disobey my rules, you are offending my holiness and my glory, and you are making me angry. That's why you should not run out in the street." Is that why you shouldn't run out in the street? Because you're afraid of the father figure? Why shouldn't you run out in the street? Yeah, there's harm out there. There's danger. That's the real reason. And maybe little toddlers do need to go through a phase when they need the parental authority. So what your friend just described to you is a toddler kind of mentality, assuming that we're never going to grow up, our brains are never going to get to a place of reason and moral philosophy. Well, we realize there's danger out in that street, and I need to take measures to avoid that danger, which is what real morality is. So the Bible says the fear of the Lord is the beginning of wisdom. And fear not him who harms your body, but he who can cast your whole body and soul in hell. The whole biblical morality is a fearful morality. There's no acknowledgement in the Bible of human beings have a right to be treated with fairness or dignity or respect. You don't see any of that. It's all human beings are worms and small and little. We're slaves. We need to submit. And then if we're scared of the daddy, then we'll do what daddy tells us, right? But we don't stay kids our whole life. So I think you might want to say to her, well, I think your moral system makes sense maybe for you, but I've grown up, actually. And I can think for myself now. And if she takes that as ridicule, well, what are you going to say? Oh, there's Deacon Ted.
Yeah.
Ted Etchen.
You've done a good job lecturing to us today and doing a lot of reasoning and arguing and so on like that. I'd like your thoughts on my approach when I deal with believers. I like to ask questions of them, and I will present God's Word to them in the Holy Book, the Bible. And one of the strongest examples I have is, I think in 1 Timothy it says, women shall not be permitted to teach in church, shall remain silent, not usurp authority over man, and be in submission. And then I asked them, in light of that, which is in the Bible that you tell me is God's Word, I wonder if you could explain to me why the national presiding bishop of the U.S. Episcopal Church today is Catherine Jefferts Schori. Could you explain that to me, please? And then I sit down. I don't do the argumentation. I've backed them into the corner. And this, I think, is a helpful way to pursue our cause. What are your thoughts on that?
Well, I agree with you, Ted. Just like you, I'm a smart aleck. I know. If you know a little bit of Bible, it goes a long way. And let them think and show the contradictions. And I debated Muslim scholars where the same issue came up, about female. They said, in Islam, there is equality between men and women. That's what he said during our debate. And these women were out there all covered from head to toe, right? And I asked him, his name was Abdullah, I said, how come those women are all covered up like that? And he says, well, because they know that men have sexual temptations, and if men saw that, And I said, Abdullah, you're a good-looking guy, and I can see your arm, I can see your neck, Abdullah. And those women have sexual temptations too, don't they? And I asked him, and he kind of blushed, Because really Islam and the patriarchal religions are really about control of access to females. That's really, and even the Bible, the whole Old Testament is about that too. But I asked him, so could a woman be a caliph? You said there's equality, right, in Islam. Could a woman be a caliph, the high leader? he said, oh no, a woman could never be a caliph. And I said, but you said there was equality. Well, because if a woman is a caliph and she's married, there would be a higher authority over her. So she couldn't be a caliph. So, yeah, it's a good technique, I think, to use. Speaking of the Bible, by the way, my next book that's coming out is based on Richard Dawkins. You know Richard Dawkins' famous sentence in The God Delusion, where he said, the God of the Old Testament is arguably the most unpleasant character in all fiction. Jealous and proud of it, petty, unjust, a vindictive, bloodthirsty ethnic cleanser, a misogynistic, homophobic, racist, infanticidal, genocidal, filicidal, pestilential, megalomaniacal, sadomasochistic, capriciously malevolent bully. 19 adjectives there. And he asked me to help him look up the Bible verses for all of those. And then he said, you know what? That would make a great book. That would make a good book, if the pun. And so the book's coming out in February, Sterling Publishing, one chapter for each of those 19 in part 1, which documents in great detail, using the Bible itself. Here we are, 2 leading atheists asking the world, please, read the Bible. Here's the verses. Read it, please, read it. And actually, in my research, it took 16 months. In my research, I found out more. So part 1 of the book is the 19 chapters. It's called Dawkins Was Right. But part 2 of the book is 8 more chapters. Dawkins was too kind. So it'll be, and then I have a final chapter about Jesus. It's called God, the most unpleasant character in all fiction. And I'm really excited about that. Steven Pinker just wrote a really good blurb for it, too. So use the Bible. We should read the Bible. It seems kind of boring, doesn't it, to open the Bible and read it, right? It seems, right? Somebody's got to do it. So, and I made it easy. I bold-faced all the words. You can basically kind of skim down the page and go, yep, okay, jealous, mean, misogynist, yep, okay, there we go. End of argument. So.
We have just a couple more quick ones.
Hi. It's my first time here, so my question might seem a bit off, but I'm selfish. I need an answer, so that's why I'm asking. I would like for you to talk about the transformation trip you took from being very Christian to not being Christian. I am in that process right now, and it's a long process and painful and lonely, very emotional. So on one hand, you see all kinds of contradictions. On one hand, you grew up, religious. So you have your family, you have your friends, who share, the same beliefs, right? Then the 10 Commandments are not bad commandments. They're good commandments, right? There are good things that any religion teaches.
Three of them are good.
Okay, so there are good things. 3 or 5 or 10, whatever.
3 of them, only 3.
Okay. Okay, so there are good things, right? There are good things that are going on there, right? So it's hard to let go because there are good things. But then on the other hand, you start also seeing bad things. So, for example, a woman is having a child and it's a very happy moment. You go to church, the priest is very happy, supportive, and so on, right? And then you have the child, and you can't enter the church unless you're cleansed, as if you were a murderer. So it doesn't end up, right? So you get to a point where you actually see these contradictions, and you get to a point where you realize that you started on this road, right? So it's lonely. So I want to hear, how was it for you, and how did you make it?
Yeah, I felt exactly like you. I loved it so much. I gave it up reluctantly because I had good Christian friends. I had a Christian life. I'd written Christian musicals that actually I'm still getting royalties from today. And I was all happy, and I reluctantly gave it up because it's not true. For me, it was intellectual. And then later came the moral questions. And as I said earlier, I wrote the whole story in my book, Godless, which tells that whole story. And just like you, it was gradual. It was like, oh, ow. It almost felt like I was spitting on my grandmother. You know what I mean? It's like I'm denying. And you hear a lot of people say that. In fact, Mandisa Thomas and others, and Jeremiah Camara, others say that when they're blacks and they left the black community, they also left their religion. They were actually leaving their whole community because they were all religious. And so when they were raising questions about God, it was like, well, what about your identity as a human being, right? So I felt all of that, and it's a gradual process of growing up that doesn't have one moment. Maybe for some of you there was a one moment. I don't know. But if you're like me and her, we were so into it that it was so meaningful to us. My father-in-law, Annie Laurie's father, he was a little boy in church in Missouri. He was like 8 years old or 10 years old. He was sitting there in church with his parents, and then he looked around, and it dawned on him. He looked around and he said, "My parents are nuts." He was a little kid, and he knew right then, right? I admire that. I think that's incredible that a little kid would just, for me, it took all these years of agony and thought, and I'm wrestling with all these things, and Annie Laurie, when she hears these things, she just snickers, like, why are you torturing yourself over this? You know what I mean? So you and I had to go through that, and it was a long process. It was difficult. I lost a lot of friends, but some of them stayed friends, which is kind of neat. That's a great way to test your friendship, by the way. Because true friends are really friends, and if the friendship is contingent on you belonging in the same group, well, then you're not really friends, are you? Then you really haven't lost anything, have you? Because it wasn't a real friendship. It was a conditional friendship. So there's a lot more to say about that, but maybe godless would help a little. But you're not alone. Thousands of people have gone through it. People in this room have gone through that same thing, right? Some of you.
Two quick ones left.
What is your attitude about cartoons of Muhammad?
Yeah, we were in Paris this last summer, and we saw some of those Je suis Charlie, you know, the posters. And in a country of free speech, we should not only tolerate, but we should welcome ridicule. Not that we agree with it all, and not that I agree with everything Charlie Hebdo printed, right? But did you know that there is a depiction of Muhammad, a carving of Muhammad at the United States Supreme Court? Did you know that? There's up in one of the friezes up on is it the south wall? No, on the north wall. There's a frieze. It faces west, right? So on the north wall, there's a frieze of Muhammad holding the Quran, and it's against Islamic law to have an image of Muhammad. So why is it still there? Why is it there? Why aren't not the Muslims burning down the Supreme Court? Some of them complained when the architect put that there without thinking about it too much. There's also Moses over on this side. Moses is like number 6 in line, and Muhammad's like number 6 in line over here. And the architect said, I didn't realize that. I was trying to be respectful to you by putting that up, right? But these cartoons of Muhammad are deliberately disrespectful. And there's a place for that, I think. Maybe it's not always the wisest thing to do. If you were in a different country doing that, you might be in real trouble. But are we going to allow violence and threats of violence to dictate what kind of art we can make and what kind of comments we can make? So I think there is a place for that, as long as that's not all we do. As long as we can show the world there's freedom. We have freedom of expression. And sometimes people's beliefs really are stupid. The people may not be. They may be sincere. The people might be good people. They might be followers. But sometimes their beliefs are actually ridiculous beliefs. Why not say so? For fear of hurting their feelings or for fear of violence against them? So I'm not going to tell you what to do, but I wouldn't hesitate to express my views whenever and however it happens. And I do public debates in front of large audiences, mixed audiences, and we've had threats. We've had death threats at our organization, and we've had to call the police now and then because of different threats that have come in. And we had a live shooter training at our building a few weeks ago. And the police said, nothing's going to happen in downtown Madison, but you never know. There might be some nut. Are we going to allow some extremist to dictate what kind of art we want to make, what kind of statements we want to say to the world?
And one last question.
This is kind of related to what the young lady over there asked, but when you first left, stopped being a preacher, what was your family's response, and how did you maintain those relationships without feeling like the little kid in church who was like, my parents are crazy? Because that's exactly how I feel about my family, who's very religious. I think that they're crazy, but I'm not willing to necessarily have them entirely out of my life, and sometimes that balance is kind of difficult. So I'm just wondering how that was for you, and was your immediate family understanding and supportive, or were there kind of obstacles to face?
Yes and no. Yeah, it happens that way. So my family, my dad was seminary trained, and my mom was a Sunday school teacher, and my brother Darrell was a missionary like me. My brother Tom was a strong believer. But when I came out as an atheist, the minister of the family, my little brother Darrell said, "Yeah, me too." Of course, I always thought he was kind of a lousy Christian anyway. He was kind of... And he admits it. Darrell says, "My whole Christian life was, how much sin can I commit and still get into heaven?" You know, his whole, and I always thought he was way over the line. But so Darrell became an atheist humanist. Then my mom did about a couple years later, which is really amazing. She stopped going to church, stopped teaching Sunday school, and we have a loving family. We're lucky. A lot of families aren't that lucky. But my mom said, "Well, you know, Danny's a good guy, and there must be something true about what he's saying." She was shunned by her church. It was horrible. They thought she was the devil when she left. And about a year later, my dad, too. My dad said, "You know what?" He threw Danny in the towel. "You know, Danny's right." We were arguing. We had a friendly argument. We like each other. You know what I mean? It was not, negative at all. So Mom and Dad became strong atheists. But our brother Tom, the middle brother, he's still a born-again Christian, a great guy. And we realize there's more important things to talk about in our family than what divides us. We have a history. We love our mom. We love our history. So when we get together, I was at his apartment last fall in Riverside, California, and it was kind of weird because he's really a great guy. He's smart. He's a retired high school principal. But have you ever been to somebody's home and there's something wrong? You don't know what's wrong with their home. There were no books. Have you ever been in a home where there's no books? I mean, that's kind of weird. Except he did have the Bible and the Purpose-Driven Life right above the TV. And I bet he hasn't opened either of them. You know what I mean? So every family's different. And only you know what your family's like, and only you know how far you can go. Your family knows you, and they see what kind of person, they see your qualities, they see your morality in your life. So only you can decide. I mean, there's no one-size-fits-all answer. But I don't think, one thing my parents told me as Christians was we should never be afraid to speak what we think is the truth, right? And that's a valuable lesson. I told Mom and Dad, you taught me that as a kid, not to be afraid to stand up and speak so I'm taking your advice here. And in my case, it worked. It worked pretty neat. But so I don't know. And when you go to a family get-together, you don't want to have arguments, do you? You want to just have a family get-together. Talk about. So maybe we should just keep it like that when we get to our personal families.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.